What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and returning to the podcast, New Testament scholar over at Princeton Theological Seminary, former colleague at the University of Edinburgh, Matt Novenson. That's right. And this episode I'm super pumped about. I've been having an idea. It's like, I want to do something that kind of introduces people to different kind of the edge of research in different areas, all in one podcast. And I thought, let me ask my buddy Matt, because he keeps up with it's his job. He's a New Testament professor. You're supposed to know these things. You have to supervise a bunch of dissertations. What are the current research areas? So I emailed Matt and was like, hey, this is cool. You're now at Princeton. All the people that listen to the podcast in America that might be thinking about a PhD program, they like that Bible. I'm like, you could help them think through what are the most kind of like pressing new research is being done. What are the different areas in the New Testament? Introduce us to them. And it'll be entertainment or infotainment for people that aren't considering graduate school. But if you're thinking there, what are some of the like biggest questions on our horizon? Boom, there's someone helping you out. And then he comes back to me and says, look, here, I've organized around these different research areas, new stuff that's going on. And then I picked a particular scholar who represents some of the best parts of that field at a school that takes PhD students and at schools that take PhD students with funding. And so, well, I hope you all enjoy this format. I would love to do it and have people from different disciplines come on because it was quite a bit of fun just to hear all the different ways New Testament studies is interacting with other disciplines to generate new research projects. You're all about to hear it, and it's always good to get to talk to my buddy Matt. So here we go, and I will put links over to all the different people and the text that he mentions in the post. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and my friend Matthew Novenson, who's a professor at Princeton Theological Seminary, New Testament scholars, back on the podcast. We were talking. He's now at Princeton, and one of the things you do is you supervise PhD dissertations. And so I wanted to talk to him about what's actually taking place in New Testament studies. What are the different research areas that are getting lots of interest, not just for all the listeners to hear these kind of like the frontier, these edges in research, but for those of you that are interested in pursuing graduate work to get to hear these different topics so you can just kind of marinate. Think about that email you're going to send when you're approaching people about study and such. And so Matt kindly sent me 5 different areas, someone who's in that research area that you could go study with at schools with this magical thing called funding, because believe it or not, religion PhDs, not a growth industry. So it's probably good to avoid student loans when getting it. But Matt, thanks you for saying yes to this weird idea. And I hope people enjoy it, because I personally just sitting around Googling about all these and reading some of the work of your friends. I'm like, I need to have them on the podcast.
Oh, it's good. It's good to be back. It'll be fun it's a fun thing to talk about. So I've been looking forward to it.
Maybe a place to begin is for you to share a bit about your own process. Like when you were in graduate school and thinking about what's going on, like when you were a young student and then figuring out like what's the program to go to, how do you come up with a research project in an area that's kind of like live and fertile. Take us back in time to, younger Matt. And, but before our hair all started thinning and we had children and stopped sleeping and these kind of things. What did that process of coming up with your own kind of research project and finding the right mentor look like?
Well, let's see. I suppose I did it probably like you, like a lot of people who end up as scholars. Like I started reading in the area I was interested in, and then, identifying names of people who were doing this work, and then figuring out those are, real people in places you can go to. And that's how I sort of first stumbled into it. Things change, from year to year. Faculty retire, new faculty come in. Sometimes whole programs will, open or close or things like that. But it tends to be that there's a kind of familiar cast of characters of universities and seminaries and departments and so on that, because a lot of universities, especially state ones, just don't have the study of theology or religion. So a few state universities do in the United States. In other countries, a lot of state universities do. And then in this, in the US, a number of private universities and seminaries do. So I knew I wanted to work in the New Testament and maybe especially Paul. So I ended up as a student at Princeton Seminary because back in the early aughts when I was looking at this, it was a great place to study Paul and had been for a long time. It was kind of an emphasis of theirs. And then finding a topic is really trial and error. I mean, the process of finding a research topic can be greatly aided by discussions like this. Like basically, if you can find some shortcuts or some people who have already distilled what's going on out there in the field, you can get some of that from reading recent journal issues and recent books and so on. Occasionally there are works published that are, just on kind of here's what's going on in gospel studies or in New Testament theology or whatever. So, but yeah, I mean, as a grad student, some people, come in with a topic idea and end up writing their dissertation on exactly that. And I was like the opposite of that. I had 3 or 4 different ones that, got scrapped before I finally found one that stuck. Yeah. So that's a really common experience, I think, actually is perfectly normal to circle around that idea and then realize it's already been done or isn't well formed and then go on to the next thing. That's really normal. So these headings I brainstormed with you today are some sort of general areas under which there could be a lot of different projects where I think, and it's not just me, I don't think these aren't idiosyncratic choices, but they're meant to be shortcuts to, areas of research where there's a lot of cool stuff going on and still more room for new projects. So people might want to read some of the books and in the areas we're talking about, but also, if anyone's interested in master's or PhD programs, these are things you could work on. And we'll talk about some particular people like supervisors, scholars doing interesting work that you could work with. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe the thing before looking at these kind of 5 different areas that you highlighted is to give us an idea of just how broad, like what all's included in New Testament studies, because some of these examples may not be the things that immediately come to mind. Like you might go, "Oh, I'm going to study Philemon," or this kind of thing. But there's a whole lot that's included in potential research topics.
Yeah. So the New Testament itself is a pretty small corpus, right? You said 27 books, but some of those are really short, like Philemon or 3rd John or Jude or, a page, less than a whole page. So it's a small corpus in a sense. New Testament is recognized as a kind of sub-discipline in our field. But if you think about it comparatively, right, compared to like people get a PhD in English literature or in history, and to get a PhD in New Testament is a tiny, tiny specialization. Now, because the New Testament has been so, it's so tremendously influential in history and theology and so on, there's a rationale for why that tiny corpus accounts for a whole discipline. But nevertheless, the upshot of that is that to study New Testament is really to study sort of that corpus as the center, but then kind of rippling out in all kinds of directions. So New Testament studies involves a lot of ancient history and culture and language and literature. And so we'll talk about some of those things under these headings. And then it also is importantly, as folks will understand, if they come to the New Testament with an interest in theology, the New Testament is older than the discipline of Christian theology, but it's always been really interwoven with it. So a large part of New Testament studies isn't studying just the text and the authors and the context, although it does involve that, but then all their afterlives, their effects, their use down the centuries, their uses today, and so on. So, often we, especially teachers and scholars, will kind of like artificially kind of quarantine off New Testament from theology and say, it's all about, you've got to learn Greek and you've got to learn original historical context and so on. And we're always kind of, sometimes can be perceived as kind of raining on the parade of theologians who want to like use the biblical text to talk about profound theological ideas. But I think if you do New Testament training right, you have to discipline yourself to learn the ancient stuff, but then you can come out the other side and bring back in all these big questions, theological and philosophical and so on. So in a way, New Testament studies, it's focused on this tiny center, but then it opens out really wide.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so the first kind of research area is New Testament and Jewish studies. So, obviously there's one of those places of how the historical context and the other text from the time period of the New Testament and preceding it end up helping us have a new way of setting these texts so often kind of put in a theological Christian context in their own space.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you and I have discussed this general issue on the podcast before, and you have with some other authors and scholars you've talked with. But the New Testament comes down to us as Christian scripture, right? It's Christians who read it. But one of the big historical points that makes a big difference is that Jesus and all the disciples and probably most of the authors of all the books in the New Testament were Jewish themselves. So Judaism of the early Roman Empire as a context for the life of Jesus and the ministry of the apostles and so on is really important. Now, Jewish studies as an academic discipline in universities nowadays has often been a little bit bracketed off from New Testament because New Testament has been cloistered usually in, divinity faculties, seminaries, things like that. But Jewish studies is the academic discipline that looks at, the whole history of and culture of Jews and Judaism and their texts and traditions and everything. So some really interesting scholars, I mean, this has been happening, for 50 years or more. Scholars have kind of transgressed the boundaries between the traditional divinity disciplines and then, for the case of the New Testament and differently the Hebrew Bible too, actually, if divinity faculties didn't exist, if you could go back many centuries and kind of imagine they didn't exist, then you could imagine that these books might have been studied in Jewish studies faculties instead because they're works from the history of Judaism. So there's lots of really cool and interesting research sort of trying to bring these two things together. This corpus, which was traditionally, studied only by Christians in Christian theology faculties, and then bringing it into conversation with cutting edge research from Jewish studies more broadly.
Maybe what's like when you're teaching kind of an intro class to New Testament and such, or is there a particular place or two where this research area has changed the way, say, future clergy at Princeton or whatever, when they're taking New Testament? What are some places this research area shows up when introducing these sacred texts, but now in the light of this larger conversation?
Yeah. So, I mean, I see it a lot teaching letters of Paul, which I did in Edinburgh and now do in Princeton Seminary, to especially, not only, but especially Christian students, many of them, accustomed to reading Paul's letters as scripture and so on. So as Christian documents. And there's all kinds of things that if you're looking at it sort of in a strictly historical lens, then, there are, I mean, even down to the meanings of particular words that we recognize that are familiar to us through Christian tradition that actually originally weren't. And so there's a lot of like retranslating and stuff we do. So for instance, I mean, the Greek word ekklesia, which is where we get, it's usually translated church. So very important sort of word in Christian history, but that occurs first of all in the New Testament in letters of Paul. But like that's an existing Greek word. It's much older than the Christians. So it just means assembly, basically. And there's interesting work about, what we call synagogues, meaning Jewish kind of religious gatherings outside the temple in the ancient world. There's a whole cluster of words used for both of these. And so, for instance, sometimes what we would call a synagogue can, in ancient terms, be called an ecclesia or an assembly. And conceivably, some of the early groups of Christ worshipers might have called themselves. In fact, there's one instance in the New Testament where this is a possibility. Might have been called a synagogue rather than a ecclesia. Anyway, so just sort of like de-Christianizing some of these translations that make words look like they are uniquely Christian words, right? Like church, when they're not. They're general purpose ancient words, and many of them have a lot of currency in, from our sources, have currency in ancient Judaism. So, I mean, the other ringer you and I have discussed before is, this is low-hanging fruit. The word translated Christ in the New Testament is the same word that means Messiah or anointed one when it's in non-Christian Greek texts. And it's only an overfamiliarity that makes us read it as if it's a Christian word when it's not originally. So
Yeah, That's helpful. So, one of the scholars working in this area, Matthew Tissson, who's been on the podcast recently, the first time he talked about this kind of, the Jewish context for and Jewish studies changing the way we read and understand Jesus and his own ministry, proclamation, and such. Then last time on Paul, but so people might be more familiar with him than some of the other examples you give. But when you think of this particular research area, and if you're interested in it and getting to know, say, his work, what is the kind of a approach for thinking about connecting with him at McMaster, or the kind of relationship a scholar that's already established in that area plays for a young kind of emerging scholar?
Yeah, Tissot is a great example of this kind of work. He's really smart and interesting scholar. He studied Jewish studies actually in Oxford and then did a New Testament PhD at Duke. And his published work has kind of brought, these disciplines together. So, so the book on the slide here, one of his relatively recent ones, is a really good example. Jesus and the Forces of Death is about the stories in the Synoptic Gospels about Jesus and ritual impurity. So ritual impurity, for instance, of the woman with a hemorrhage of blood, or of people with lepra, so-called lepers, whom Jesus purifies of their impurity. So this book argues, I think overwhelmingly compellingly, it's a really remarkable book, that Christians are most accustomed to reading these stories as if Jesus came along to abolish the Jewish purity system, thinking that the system itself, which is of course instituted in the Torah, in the law of Moses, but Christians read it as if the system itself were oppressive or legalistic or otherwise sort of bad, and so Jesus comes along to scrap it, which is totally wrong. And Tissot shows how that's wrong and what's the case instead, that ritual impurity in the Gospels, as actually in the Torah and in, well, not only a lot of ancient Jewish sources, but in the ancient world generally. Most cultural groups had an idea of ritual impurity, things that, features of the life cycle that would make you sort of, temporarily not fit for entering sacred space. So if you've recently had to bury one of your parents or grandparents, it's relatively normal across cultures that you're sort of, as you've been in contact with death, then you can't be in contact with a temple or shrine or sacred space. Anyway, so Tissot rereads the Jesus encountering ritual impurity stories in the Gospels, and he argues that Jesus isn't abolishing the system that distinguishes pure from impure. Instead, he's abolishing the real stuff of ritual impurity itself, because he is the Holy One of God. He has within himself this sort of a power of purity that can sort of just dissolve or destroy ritual impurity, the effect of which then is to make human beings, to bring them back into proximity to God. It's really kind of revolutionary for these ways of reading these stories. And it just is a matter of kind of looking at it not from a received Christian way of viewing things, even though in the long history of Christianity, Christians too have had systems of ritual purity, but moderns, and especially Protestants, don't tend to think in those terms. So it's an example of how some bringing research from Jewish studies into conversation with some really familiar stories from the Gospels can make you read them totally differently and entirely for the better. So that's a really good example of how Jewish studies research can kind of help you read the New Testament well. Yeah. And Tisson's at McMaster University in Canada, where you can get a master's or a PhD. They've got good folks up there.
So when I read that book, I found it really fascinating, just coming from the kind of philosophy, science, and religion area, that the purity violations, you're right, we have an evolved mechanism that, depending on the person, it's, there are variations of how intense it is, right? Some people, the idea of sitting on your bed unmade and clothes you wore outside, they're like, how would you ever sleep in there? And others, you're just like, no worries. But this kind of, there's a dial of just how, of sensitivity to impurity, and it shows up across religious, different cultures. Obviously, it shows up in religion as the way we symbolically describe these kind of purity normative things. And what's fascinating to me when I read his book is that if you recognize if you take the Jewish studies context and think about it, the outcome or the invitation Jesus is through his own enactment, inviting disciples into, is not to break systems that help us mediate our relations, but detach the system from the affirmation of the other's value.
Mm.
Right. And so, like, when you recognize, it's like Jesus going, like, yeah, we have this, this is who we are. And it shows up in these places. And it's not even like it's dumb. Like, it's really good that in the Torah, you take dumps outside the city. It's a high quality maneuver. Actually really good sanitation work. But the intricacies of thinking about this and negotiating life are not ways you then export those judgments, put them in the mouth of God and put them on other people. And then, and so the just like the combination, when I was reading it in that context and then thinking about the way the way this shows up in our kind of moral psychology, which is areas like a relatively recent growth in moral psych, you could see a different kind of wisdom that shows up just in the way Jesus is relating to it, to say something like, yeah, both institutions and cultures and individuals will have this sense of judging the other on behalf of some kind of external moral framework. But the reality, the divine reality Jesus is enacting, is one that doesn't justify or legitimate the social kind of cutting the person out of our social environment or an assessment of their value before the divine. And I wouldn't have like ever made those connections if I hadn't, ended up reading the book and talking to him about it.
It is, yeah, it is a great one. It's, it's very detailed, kind of in the weeds about legal reasoning around ritual categories, but it's actually a very profound theological idea. Tisson's reading of the gospel stories, and he's leaning on Jacob Milgram's account of Leviticus. But that the argument is the logic, the way it works is that God is the God of life, and all the ritual purity codes pertain to ritual impurity pertains to or is generated by death or exposure to death, and because God doesn't have death in God's self, that's that's the logic to the codes. And so what Jesus does with the people he meets is actually to do away with death or the sort of residue of it, because that's what people need to live up close to God is to. So anyway, yeah, has all kinds of interesting implications, but it comes from just an ability to read slightly otherwise.
Yeah.
So,
all right. So the next area was New Testament and ancient Mediterranean religions.
So in the history of New Testament studies, people like the old textbooks and so on tended to talk about like two equal and opposite backgrounds to the New Testament, Jewish and Greco-Roman, which is a mistake because there aren't just two ancient cultures relevant to the New Testament, and those are not sort of either equal or opposite. Sort of, the ancient Mediterranean religions here means like a very big umbrella for the whole world in which the New Testament stories take place and the books were written and they circulated, and of which ancient Judaism was one kind of local indigenous culture, and of which Hellenism and then later the Roman Empire were sort of these big culturally hegemonic and politically hegemonic forces. But then there's lots and lots of other local indigenous cultures in Egypt and Arabia and Asia Minor and so on. And so this is a more contemporary and heuristically better way of understanding what sometimes used to just be called classics, like the Greek and Roman world, and in particular religion in that context. So this is it's not a separate thing from Jewish studies, but in a way you could look at as kind of zooming out and taking learning and information from the study of classics, ancient Greece and Rome and other ancient cultures, and thinking about the New Testament as sort of, Jewish or Jewish adjacent literature from this really big wide world. And well, the other more polemical term that used to be associated is sometimes still associated with this kind of body of material is paganism, meaning just non-Jewish, non-Christian antiquity. But, again, pagans are not, that's a pagan arose as a kind of Christian term of slander or abuse for other people, but it just means other ancient religious people. And so there's whole bodies of knowledge about the way religion worked in the ancient world, like the example of ritual impurity we've been talking about, that has let scholars get really interesting purchase on the New Testament.
Yeah, and this kind of like taking back and taking a bigger step is something you see here in New Testament studies, but at least from my understanding, this is a kind of practice that historians in general are doing in across different historical epochs at this present, right? Like that the tendency for much of the later half of the 20th century in PhD programs and research projects has been the kind of hyper specialization into something so specific that all sorts of advances are done there. But then the kind of what's gained by integrating it in the larger cultural historical context is often missed. So there's like collections of there's this research, and then once you put it in this larger frame, different connections get made, ones that are more embedded in the culture itself. Or the same kind of thing happens, say, in kind of the project I was working on in Edinburgh was around consciousness studies, like even in science, right? There are all these different research programs understanding these little things about trying to understand consciousness. But when you get to the point that our major metaphysical options to integrate all the data don't work, then you're like, oh, I guess we need to take a step back. What are the questions about our assumptions about the way science works? And the picture we're having there. And one of the things that's kind of exciting about this area of work is I think we all know you couldn't give an account of, say, even the practice of one's faith in the community you're a part of without understanding where we are in American history. What was the economic situation? What were the political dynamics? What were the pressures being put on the congregation? Like what's their race, gender, and class, and what are the dynamics there? It's like without understanding kind of a thick account of culture, even the most helpful work at something specific can the wrong things can be brought to like up to investigation for interpreting it, and having a thicker account of the historical context actually allows more synthetic or integrative elements when putting these particular investigations in context.
Yeah, this is exactly that in the context of New Testament studies. That is to say, what we're looking at here isn't, historically speaking, unique. It has to make sense in the ancient world of which it's part. And that means not just the religiously Jewish world, which is kind of the most immediate context, but because, the characters in the New Testament and the authors of the New Testament and the circulation of the books in the earliest period, was part of this whole ancient Mediterranean milieu, then zooming out a bit, talking at a higher level of abstraction, not just, in the most immediate specific terms about your text, can actually then help you get a lot better purchase on some of those particular things. So that's the big idea.
Yeah. And here's one of your colleagues from McGill. Is it Heidi Wendt?
Heidi Wendt. Yeah. So this is a really good example of this kind of research. So Heidi Wendt did a PhD at Brown University, where they have a tradition of doing this kind of research in the New Testament really well. And her book is a really good example of this. So the title's At the Temple Gates. The subtitle is The Religion of Freelance Experts in the Roman Empire. And she discusses, so it's not a New Testament book. It's about a certain kind of religious practitioner in the early Roman Empire. And one of her key examples, though, is the Apostle Paul. So for Pauline studies, her book has ended up being quite rightly influential, but not because she wrote a whole book on Paul, but because she has a chapter on Paul, along with a lot of parallel studies of other historical figures we know of from the early Roman Empire who were, well, what she means by freelance expert is, Paul, right? If you think about the case of Paul, he's influential in the Christ assemblies he's writing to, but we know that he has to compete for influence with other people sometimes, like in Galatians, this fight over whether the people he's writing to should get circumcised or not. It's an issue because some people are telling them yes, and other people, like Paul, are telling them no. And no one has like the presumptive right there's not a pope or even a bishop in this case who could just resolve it by virtue of his office. And Paul is not Paul's not a priest in the Levitical sense, right? He's not from Levi. He's not ordained as a priest. So he is literally a freelance expert, and his by his own account, his legitimation comes directly from the risen Christ via a revelation. But of course, you can see how that can look kind of tenuous to people he's talking to, because other people claim to have direct legitimation by God, right? And there's a whole set of characters from the ancient world about whom there are some accounts, written accounts, not nearly as much as in the case of Paul, but there are others. And so Wendt compares these to one another and develops this type of what was probably socially a really important role in this time period. That is the freelance religious expert. And Paul's a really well-attested example of this. And if you think about him in those terms, kind of alongside the parallels that Wendt's discussing, then a lot of the problems he faces and a lot of the kind of arguments he makes make a little clearer sense. If you think, yeah, I mean, he's having to basically construct his own authority if he hopes to be listened to by the people he's trying to persuade.
Which is so different than how Christians who are like, oh, he's the apostle to the Gentiles. He's in the New Testament. And then so much of our interpretation of Paul comes from people reading these texts with a kind of canonical, saintly, authoritative status rather than seeing him within the historical context of how these kind of freelance teachers functioned.
Yeah, that's right. We think of him as a saint because he's come down to us that way. But in his original context, he didn't already have saint status. And
so the halo in the pictures isn't just the one he rocked around with?
That's secondary, right? And there was an actual kind of, this is what Wendt paints this, develops this picture of how these freelance experts worked. It's a little bit like influencer culture or something nowadays, like people who are sort of competing for attention with on the force of their own charisma or ability to kind of get people to listen to them. And that's going on in the early Roman Empire, within the Christ groups, with even in some New Testament texts where, say Paul and the people he just calls agitators in Galatia are fighting with one another for influence over these believers. And also then, so within Christianity, but also between Jews and Christians and other ancients, especially went to argue sort of, there was a kind of fashion for preaching new gods from foreign countries that were kind of exotic and would catch people's interest. Say, I've got something new. You need to, you need to learn about this God. You need to be initiated into him. You need to kind of learn his mysteries. And so that kind of culture of competition among people who don't have institutional approval. They don't, they're not born into a priesthood or belong to an established institutional college of priests or something like that. But they're mixing it up, trying to win adherents, kind of like popular philosophers, which is another part of the whole study of ancient Mediterranean religion. But in particular, Wendt studies about people, proclaiming or channeling particular gods or heroes. Mm-hmm. So it's what we more easily recognize as religious. And that makes actually a lot of really good sense of a lot of bits and pieces of the New Testament.
Mm-hmm. So isn't it in Corinthians where he's talking about like super apostles and that kind of stuff? Is that, do places like that where where he's in some ways critical of others functioning in this, with the whatever the Second Temple period influencer culture, it is part of what's going on there, kind of like he's obviously functioning in that role, but then his commitment to the church writ large is one where the authority or content of the gospel is not really based on his appeal, but the resurrection or something like that.
Yeah. So yes, that's another relevant passage that it's in the end of 2 Corinthians is Paul kind of rants about what he calls super apostles, kind of ironically. But yeah, that's an interesting example this way, because in Galatians, it's clear that like they're having a fight. They have different policies, right? Either baptized Gentiles should undergo Jewish circumcision or should not. That's the fight. And in Galatians, Paul says that he is, the other people aren't to be trusted, in part, I think, because he thinks they're not sort of properly circumcised originally Jewish apostles themselves. In 2 Corinthians, the super apostles, the interesting thing there is there's no discussion of circumcision, or really, it's not clear if they have a policy difference at all. But, and Paul says about them, are they Jewish? Are they Hebrew? Are they Israelites? So am I. Like, we don't know who they are exactly. There's a good argument that they might be Apollos and people sort of in the circle of Apollos. But anyway, there it just seems to be about jurisdiction or control, or like who has the right to be listened to in this context. And it's not exactly like, what is traditionally called false teaching, in that it's not clear that Paul thinks they're teaching anything different from what he's teaching. But he says, I am your father, in that I'm the one who came to you first and baptized you, and so on. So that's another example of probably kind of in-group competition among these experts, where they're claiming, in that case, claiming authority due to their kind of pedigree. Like Paul says, well, they are Hebrews and Israelites, but so am I. But then Paul says, but you can trust me more because I've suffered more than they have, right? So this famous passage where he says how many violent events he's undergone, and that those are like that's his CV, that's his credentials of why he should be listened to.
I read this book, maybe it was Gaze of Romesh, or this is 15 years ago, but it was some Jesus scholar, but part of putting him in historical context was comparing kind of Jesus' teachings and acts to other Jewish figures of that time period, right? Where, then it makes sense that, well, I mean, the miracle, what does that exactly prove? Because there are these other people that do this, and this is the way these kind of vocational forms took shape in this historical context. Something like that. And I don't remember the exact details because it just popped in my head while you're talking. It seems like something like that's akin to a place where, say, these first two examples of like both Jewish studies and taking a step back to put these figures that are in the New Testament alongside other figures that kind of have a similar job description of sorts in their moment. It seems like there's a connection there between the two.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So yes, you're right. I mean, Gaze very much did discuss this about these kind of charismatic Jewish holy men, like rabbis who perform miracles. And Wentz account would kind of include people like that, but also zoom out to non-Jewish,
Right.
to some Greeks and Egyptians. And yeah, so she has kind of a chapter on each of a number of representative figures from different, right, indigenous cultures, from Greece and Asia Minor and Syria and so on, but who occupy this similar kind of social role, which makes it helps you see how Jesus and the apostles sort of would have looked, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you were a contemporary. So.
Mm-hmm. And is that similar to the connection of the historical Jesus with, say, like a cynic sage, or this kind of thing where there's a non-Jewish category for making correlations?
Yeah, that's right. You could say, I mean, in a way, it's this current discussion sort of builds on, or it's downstream from some of that Jesus quest stuff, like some of Don Carlson's work. It's trying to say because popular philosophers are another sort of slightly adjacent category of, or sages. That's like this, right? It's not a specifically Jewish thing, but it is a category. Well, it's not just one that we can, in retrospect, go, oh, Jesus might have looked a little bit like that. Like some ancient outsiders say that they think Jesus is a philosopher, right? Or is a magician, or is a prophet of a foreign god, or something like that. So it's filling in the pictures for how could ancient writers who weren't Christian themselves, how could they think that about Jesus? Well, because there's this type, and if you squint a little bit, you can see how he might look like.
Yeah. That's helpful. All right. So the third one is New Testament and the not just academic history of interpretation.
Yeah. So history of interpretation is this thing I gestured to earlier when I said, if you study the New Testament in college or seminary or whatever, you'll often be scolded about keeping the New Testament in its, talking about original historical context and original language and so on, and not importing your later Christian interpretations and so on, which there's a good warning in that. But also it's the case that, right, any text, and certainly biblical texts, they kind of carry around with them their whole afterlives, so that, we can and we should artificially, try to talk about Paul without channeling Luther, but eventually you're going to get around to talking about Luther, right? Like, because it's part of the story. So history of interpretation means that. And there's now a whole disciplined conversation about studying as a proper object of study itself, the history of interpretation, or the reception of biblical texts, as they come to mean new things different from what they originally meant. And a lot of that scholarship has been, and a lot of this is super helpful, is on the scholarly or academic history of interpretation. So, zooming in and saying, okay, what exactly does Origen say about this biblical text? Or what does Augustine say? Or what does Luther say? Or down to the, what does Barth say or Pannenberg say or so on? So that's history of interpretation. It's looking at these thinkers, not just for their constructive ideas, but for their interpretation of biblical texts. But then more recently still, there's been super interesting work expanding this out. I mean, there's always been a bit of this, but expanding it out, saying that the interpretation and the wider reception of biblical text isn't just an academic enterprise, right? It's in liturgy, and it's in art, and it's in music, and it's in, like, even just the documentary ephemera of people's lives, especially Christian people's lives, for whom the New Testament as scripture is kind of like part of the whole warp and woof of what they do, even when they're not like sitting down specifically studying it, right? Or reading it straight through. There have been interesting recent studies on, Jesus is the Lamb of God in medieval art, right? Or ancient Christian art, like mosaics and sculptures and so on, of Jonah, because the sign of Jonah, although it's a relatively minor biblical book, the sign of Jonah is really important for ancient Christian readers of the Gospels. So just all kinds of kind of ways the Bible has afterlives in
Yeah. I
the
like
history of
that
culture.
language, afterlives, which kind of gives the ability for the text to distinguish, right, the historical interpretation of a text in its larger context, to then letting the text have another life in these other contexts, along with our own, right? So
Those are things that happen and are worthy of study. And it's not, the forebears of modern Bible scholars were kind of like Enlightenment people, right?
Mhm.
Like early 19th century historiography. And, they tended to say things like, what we want to do is like throw in the trash all the accretions of culture and interpretation that happened between the originary moment and now. You
Mhm.
want to like just rubbish everything else, disregard it, and only look at as, a kind of pristine view on the original, which was, philosophically naive even when they said it. But also nowadays, there's a lot more willingness to say, yeah, we need to make the distinction between the many, many different meanings at different periods, but none of it sort of goes in the rubbish. Like it's all part of the story or the afterlives of a text. And
Yeah.
as with history generally, I think there's a lot more, due interest in, not just what bishops and theologians thought in their commentaries, but on what people in general have thought about or done with biblical texts. So
Mhm.
that's what I'm pointing to by not just academic history of interpretation.
Yeah. Yeah, the other day when I was talking with Dom, Crossan, and he likes to use a lot of, like, art of, to point out history of interpretation through church history, and, the biblical text, Cain kills Abel, and then God marks Cain not to get, to get killed, and apparently that was so uncomfortable that in the medieval period, there was a story that shows up in art of a hunter accidentally shooting Cain with a bow that did not exist at that, if you were trying to timeline it, where it's like, "Well, don't worry, God may not have let anyone kill him, but it was an accident, so that's like it completely doesn't violate the rule,
That's
but
fun.
now we have justice going on." I was like, "Oh, that's wild." But, you wouldn't have thought about that, right? Like, the
Yeah.
normal Protestant thing to do is just to deal with the text, and then, "Oh, we'll let the historical stuff maybe guide this," uh, but, um but not go, yeah, this tech has a lot of lives, and part of it is in different cultures and contexts, just what makes a community uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so you mentioned your colleague, Lisa Bowens. So tell us kind of like what her project's about and how it kind of exemplifies this kind of research.
Yeah. This is slightly shellfish because it's my own institution, but Princeton Theological Seminary is home to Professor Lisa Bowens, who's one of my colleagues in New Testament. And this was a previous book of hers that it's one of the most interesting recent examples of this kind of work. So this book, African American Readings of Paul, is the result of just a whole bunch of archive work that Lisa Bowens did, looking for the whole history of Black American readers of Paul. She's all the way back to like the 17th century, like colonial era, all the way up to, well, she stops actually just before the civil rights era because there's a whole lot more to take on board then. She's working on a project now actually about the reception of, well, the book of Revelation and also apocalyptic literature more generally in Martin Luther King Jr. in particular. But this book, her African American Readings of Paul, what's interesting about it is it does look at some things like sermons from the Black church tradition. So those are even those, right, are not like commentaries or sort of theological treatises. They're from the life of the church rather than from just the scholar's study or whatever. But she also looks at all kinds of documentary evidence of like autobiographies, conversion stories, even government documents. So petitions written by groups of enslaved Black Americans to colonial or state governments, petitioning for abolition of slavery and making, on biblical grounds, because they're mostly sort of Christians arguing to Christians, right? And the jumping off point for her book is there's a strand of African American interpretation of Paul that's very and rightly influential, which said because letters of Paul, especially the possibly Deutero-Pauline Colossians and Ephesians, which have the household codes that say slaves obey your masters. There's a tradition of African American interpretation of Paul that takes a very dim view of Paul. A good example is Howard Thurman, who argued sort of that Jesus
and the Disinherited.
Jesus and the Disinherited. Thurman argues that, the teaching of Jesus is a powerful sort of engine for liberation, but that the letters of Paul just are not as useful in that direction. And that's certainly part of the tradition here. But Bowens argues from all these documentary sources that actually there's an enormous amount of, basically there's a lot of African American reading of Paul over the centuries that didn't take that dim view of Paul, that like read some other. Frederick Douglass too is an important example of this in her account. Frederick Douglass reads in the pastoral epistles, also, probably Deutero-Pauline, but that says that man stealing or the enslavement of a human is a demonic work. And so Douglass argues Paul can't have supported slavery, regardless of what Colossians and Ephesians say, because of this. So the point, the kind of bottom line of Bowens's reading is actually large parts of the tradition of African American reading of Paul, which some of it is, but a lot of it's not in like books that would be sitting on your library shelf, but they'll be in the documents in like, archives from communities. There's a massive tradition of reading Paul sort of for liberation, if you know where to look. But you have to people were interpreting Paul all along and other parts of the New Testament.
Yeah.
But it's not always in, theological treatises or commentaries. It's all over the place. And so it's just a super interesting kind of cutting edge of research is finding biblical interpretation where it has been all along, but people weren't looking for it.
So one of the things this kind of research area, kind of opens up is connecting. If the first two are these different historical framings you're putting the text in, this is like all the different afterlives can open up all different spaces of connecting with it. That's a great example. Or you could think of the kind of work that you could do with, say, how base communities in El Salvador during this particular period were reading text, because there's lots of letters exchanged between people and stuff as you're getting to the councils like at Medellin and stuff, that don't show up in that particular part where there's like these interpretations of the text coming out of these base communities, or could someone be like, what's fascinating, Matt, is 90s evangelical end times fiction as an afterlife. That way you could use slides at your presentations with Kirk Cameron in it, playing
That's right.
a character
That's
from
right.
Left Behind. I mean, just saying.
Yeah. Some people have done. I've seen a few. I mean, I've seen some interesting conference papers where people have done biblical reception in 90s end time fiction or in like,
I feel like there's a
yeah,
book title just instead of like the letter Y, just the word Y2K and
yeah, that's right.
apocalyptic panic and American evangelicalism.
That's right.
Well, I can think of a lot of excursions there. Other than if you were hanging out at Princeton, they'd also get to hang out with you. So there's that.
Yep. Yep. Both you got both Lisa Bowens and me there, which is all right.
So the next one is New Testament and cultural studies.
Yeah. So this is, if any, this is maybe like, think of it as casting an even slightly wider net. So not looking for like particular moments of like conscious interpretation of the New Testament, but the way that the New Testament or scripture more generally is kind of has gotten embedded in and meshed in as part of other discourses that we know that we recognize as really important, but we sort of didn't notice that the Bible was up in it, somehow. I realize that's a bit vague, but if I show you an example, it'll begin to make sense.
We
But
can go ahead and go to the example if you think that'll help. That way.
yeah, just think. So think kind of like the last category, but like broader still. So ways
Uh-huh.
that, so remember, if to study the New Testament is to study not just it, but all the ripples that go out from it, right? This
Mhm.
is a really good example of this. So Yi-Jan Lin is professor at Yale in the Divinity School. She has this very recent book called Immigration and Apocalypse, which is a super interesting study, which comes from kind of this, what I'm calling a cultural studies angle here. Lynn sometimes uses this term too. So the book is about the book of Revelation, right? But it's also about the history of immigration policy in America. So there's a lot of like modern American political history in it. And there's a study of the book of Revelation in it. And it's all kind of woven together. And in particular, I mean, it's not the case. And Lynn doesn't argue that, you know, American immigration policy consists of, like commentary style interpretation of the book of Revelation. But so there's this famous image in Revelation of the holy city, the New Jerusalem. And one thing that makes it holy, and it's portrayed as a very happy vision because all the people of God are inside and God is there. And so, right. But it also, what makes it the holy city is that everything impure is like kept out of it and only those within the number are allowed in. And so it's like a happy vision, but it includes the exclusion of unclean or impure elements and people from outside. And so Lynn finds again, it's like political history. So she's looking at actual like bills and laws from the United States government and a lot of sort of more minor works, legal briefs and filings relative to the establishment of immigration law in the United States that to varying degrees of explicitness trade exactly on the book of Revelation and this picture of the holy city, the New Jerusalem, from which everything unclean is kept out. So in a way, it's a little bit like Bowens' study of African American interpretation of Paul, and that it's biblical interpretation in kind of unexpected places. But in the case that Lynn's looking at, often these documents like aren't even really aware that they are discussing the book of Revelation,
Yeah.
but they are, right? Like they're using the language that could only have come from there. And it's the force of this kind of idea, this image, which is in the cultural groundwater in the United States because of the reception of Christian scripture. Anyway, so this is Lynn's story simultaneously of, how the book of Revelation is read, especially this particular vivid image, and then the long and complicated and often sad story of immigration policy in the United States, where the government constructs the country as this kind of pure bounded space and constructs its purity in terms of the exclusion of.
Yeah.
Uh, so that's what I mean by cultural studies here. It's not even directly or explicitly necessary biblical interpretation.
Would
Yeah.
and that's a topic that's surprisingly timely.
Mm.
Would this kind of be as broad as say like, oh, the how Jesus shows up across time in pop music or these kind of things? Like is
Yeah. Yeah. Certainly. That would be maybe somewhere between these two. I mean, sometimes again, that's like knowing, winking, like deliberate reception, and then
Mhm.
sometimes it's just part of the cultural discourses that are downstream from that. Here's briefly another example. Actually, a previous book by Yi-Jan Lin is she wrote a really interesting book called "The Erotic Lives of Manuscripts." Uh, right, very interesting title, but it's about New Testament textual criticism. So the way scholars establish not what the words mean, but what the words actually are. Like, how do we know what words make up the text of the New Testament? Because there are thousands of manuscripts from which the editors are constructing a text. Anyway, but there's this whole discourse. It's not. I mean, it's still kind of current, but it was really big in the 19th century, especially of speaking of manuscripts as if they sexually reproduced, right? As if
Mhm.
manuscripts coupled up and then gave birth to new manuscripts, right? That's like a figure of speech for
Yeah.
when manuscripts get copied and they, take readings from different earlier manuscripts. But these 19th century scholars talked about them as parent manuscripts and child manuscripts. Anyway, so this is another example of this, a kind of called it. That's a New Testament topic, textual criticism. But Lynn spotted this thing that was, it's because of, I mean, in ways you'll understand better than I. This was like the heyday of the kind of language of Darwinian sort of
Mhm.
genetics but applied in the humanities, right, to things that aren't organisms reproducing, which is that became like this dominant model for how to explain just things, right? So we're trying to explain scribes copying manuscripts, but people chose to do it in terms of the sexual reproduction of species, right? And that, if you read textbooks on New Testament textual criticism from the 19th and the 20th century, you're getting like, you're talking about biblical manuscripts through the language of Darwin, right? Which
Which
is,
comes with a like a it comes with like a the biological language set, especially how it was functioning in the 19th century, comes with a power dynamic in it of what's most pure, what's most primary, and evaluative of different texts based on, reproducibility and all these kinds of things. So is that kind of like when language it emerges in a culture, well, it emerges in science, then becomes ubiquitous in culture, and then is appropriated in this other field. Now there's this kind of the erotic energy of biology becomes something that's culturally transferable, and then
mm,
what happens when you do that, when those dynamics are brought into another context?
yeah, I think that's the backstory to this. So, but the
That's
funny
really
thing is,
fascinating.
even I, who trained as a New Testament scholar, and until I read that book of Lynn's, I was like, oh my gosh, I never realized. Like, I still talked about manuscripts that way, and
Yeah.
and you don't recognize it as a choice, as a like
Mhm.
that's not like the obvious or inevitable or natural way to talk about it. But that's an example of how a kind of cultural studies lens that sort of looks at all the other discourses we're swimming in that impinge sometimes on, right? So we think, okay, now I'm only studying the New Testament, but actually, my brain is in a whole particular mode, and so she's kind of identifying where those kind of things come from, and why we speak about it the way we do.
Yeah, that's fun. That kind of, research projects are, I think, becoming popular across different disciplines, be it like, theologians just assume, oh, we have some idea of what faith or belief means, and then you do the genealogy of that word and you see how it transforms over time, or you start to interpret a text or think about a doctrine, and surprisingly, there's very different interpretations if it's before, we think a natural supernatural distinction is essential or after, and then like what how does this work out? And like where did that emerge in modernity? Like there are all these kinds of things that, until someone frames it in that kind of cultural with the gift of kind of like a cultural and historical studies, you don't realize the kind of inherited conclusions that you're running on that aren't there. Or think of like how many people talk about their own consciousness and such in the present using computer analogies, and computer analogies come with all sorts of assumptions that may not be accurate about the human being. Yeah, that's fun. Anyway, sorry, we don't want to miss the last one here because this one actually has the word theology in it, so I feel better.
There you go.
But New Testament and theology via hermeneutics.
Yeah. So, New Testament will always be, and it's still, it is part of the theology discussion. It should be, I think. What I said, there are all these, we scholars have built up anxieties about, what you can and can't safely say. I mean, it's almost a kind of running joke. I talk to theologian colleagues often about, say, who are used to getting their wrists slapped by Bible scholars and say, it doesn't mean that, you can't say that. But I think the best way for this relationship to work, and there's lots of places where it does, and this is what I'm pointing to here, where while we can have a perfectly appropriate discipline in, trying to be clear about original language and original historical context and so on, nevertheless, the text does come to us with all its history of entanglements. And so the best thing to do is not to sort of throw those in the rubbish or to pretend they're not there, like put on blinders and like only look at this, but to be disciplined and careful and thoughtful about putting pieces together. So what I mean by this heading is just to point in the direction to, where I think there is really good and interesting sort of reconnection or dialogue between New Testament and theology. And I include the word hermeneutics just because I think, because one of the examples I want to point to is especially good at that, but because the way this works optimally, I think is it's all for the good for theology to make a lot of hay with the New Testament and the Old Testament. It's like Scripture is it's part of the toolbox and the lingo and so on of theology. And I think it should be. I'm very happy about that. But then what we want is what you and I have been discussing all along is just a degree of precision or care in our hermeneutics and talking about what kind of interpretation I'm making at the moment and how that relates to other kinds of contemporary interpretations or to, the different meanings of the text over the centuries and so on. So I think there's really interesting work being done and still to be done, bringing New Testament and biblical studies back into theology just with hermeneutical care and precision. And that largely just means having a lot of, a willingness to learn, to read colleagues from other adjacent disciplines. And, for me, the Bible scholar, to let you, the theologian, set me straight on things if I'm unclear about, what the problem or the question or the norms for a theological discussion are. I think when this goes well, it often goes well because there's actually particular colleague relationships or friendships between people from different subfields. So if you've got, listeners out there who are interested in theology proper and putting it in dialogue with New Testament and biblical studies, you can definitely do that, even though, we scholars are sometimes a little grumpy about it. And it's a matter of finding out, who's doing it well and reading their stuff and talking to them and learning, how to pull that off. So.
Yeah, well, why don't you tell us about David, the example you give?
Yeah, so somebody I think does this really well is this guy called Dave Lincecum, who teaches at Notre Dame. He's Protestant himself, although it's a Catholic faculty, but Notre Dame's, a historic, a very storied theology faculty that is, has long been really good at kind of taking an ecumenical Catholic lowercase c approach, like dialoguing between Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox, and others as well. So Lincecum happens to be Protestant, but he's been at Notre Dame for a long time. And he's just extremely learned and very thoughtful interpreter he represents for me the kind of thing I'm trying to describe here. I try to make my work conversant with theology a little bit, but I definitely feel kind of amateurish at it. And Lincecum's really good at it. And he illustrates the what I meant by via hermeneutics. So the book up here is a brand new one, or maybe not even quite out one yet, by him with Erdman's The Commentarial Impulse, which is it's about how basically theology is made of largely sort of us interpreting or speaking with or using the words and ideas of our forebears. So he's looking at early Christians reading Paul, and then Paul who's reading a script, Jewish scripture before him. And so when they want to talk normatively or constructively about God to do theology proper, not always, but in very many cases, they're doing it by hermeneutics, by sort of reading or interpreting either scripture or sort of, venerated tradition before them. He had an earlier book that's also really excellent on Paul's interpretation of scripture, on Deuteronomy in particular. And in the context of Deuteronomy was an enormously popular and influential book in ancient Jewish interpretation, right? Like a few books of the Bible get quoted way more than other books of the Bible, and Deuteronomy is one of the ones. So he had worked on Paul and contemporary Jewish authors reading Deuteronomy, and then now he's been working on early Christians reading Paul, reading Deuteronomy and Genesis and Psalms and Isaiah and so on. So, I mean, the places that tend to really excel at this kind of hermeneutical and theological reading of scripture tend to be private, not always, but they tend to be private in Christian institutions. So Notre Dame has a long tradition of this. Linscomb's really good at it. There's a good tradition of this at Duke as well. We do it at Princeton Seminary too, I think. But I hold up Linscomb because I think he's a really good model of this. This book of his is just coming out and worth a good look. And Notre Dame is another one of these places that the theology department is very well supported by the university. They take good care of their PhD students and even their master's students, and so it's a good place to keep an eye out.
Yeah, that's awesome. The maybe the last thing I'm interested in is what kind of advice you have for people that are considering a graduate degree. If someone's approaching you or some of your colleagues and stuff that you shared, like what's the not pushy but demonstrating confidence and wanting to reach out, like what's the best way of doing these kind of approaches today?
Yeah, I think I've picked some examples of people who are super smart scholars who I also know to be good people who, if you were to drop an email to one of these people, they would give you a kind, polite reply that you deserve. A lot of scholars will. Most scholars, most scholars are not properly famous or anything. We talk with our students, and if people out there in the interested public, like who read books, are interested in the ideas we discuss, then we're generally happy to, answer an email or chat with somebody. So, I think in general, people should feel free to, briefly, politely, just cold call, email scholars, say what your interest is or your topic, and start a conversation. The only thing that's really bad form is to but you wouldn't do this with anybody, right? Is email a kind of 100-page thing of your whole,
The first 2 chapters of the thesis.
Yeah, that's right. No, just make an introduction, start a conversation, and I remember this when I was a master's student. If you're in geographical proximity to a place where some of these scholars are working, they are real people in the world, and you can. Sometimes I do this if interested readers from the general public are in the Northeast, drop by Princeton. You can have a cup of coffee and talk about what you're interested in. So I think in general it's fine. It's good form. I stumblingly did this back as a master's student. Made my first meetings with scholars, and most of us who are just regular working, gigging scholars will like to talk with people who are interested in the ideas. And so you can, if you ever are at a conference like the AAR SBL, or if there's a scholar you want to talk at some smaller gathering, like the stuff you put on, like the one you guys organized in Princeton with Hartmut Rosa, if there's an opportunity to come talk with a scholar in person, a lot of them are pretty normal people who are happy to talk about interesting ideas. So just politely knock on the door. That's that's what I would do.
Yeah. Well, this has been fun, and I hope that the listeners not just got an idea of some of the different stuff happening, but for those of you considering graduate work, now you have some guidance and things. And yeah, if I made slides, I'd put you on it. I'd be like, this is Matt Novenson. If you have to go to a place with so many Bardians, then I would go where he is. But
yeah, check out Princeton Seminary. We have some Bardians, but we got lots of other kind of theologians too.
I know. I just you don't want to pass up too many opportunities to make sarcastic asides towards Bardians.
Yeah.
They actually appreciate it. They like to feel centered in constructive theological world, and one of the ways they feel affirmed is by people with my philosophical commitments to make patronizing comments at them. They actually enjoy it.
Right.
I even get emails like, "Oh, so it's been a while since you made a sarcastic comment about Bardians." I'm just like, sorry, I didn't know that was terms of endearment for you. So
there you go. It was time for another
Hauerwasians
event.
are like that too. Oh, Cambridge Neo-Thomists, they're a lot they have a lot stronger language in their emails to you about it. Oh man, I thought of some other examples that I don't even want to get the emails.
I bet you did.
All right. Well, I'll put links to these books and the people, faculty pages and stuff in the post, and some notes about these different areas for those of you that are interested, so you can go check it out. And remember all the cool things Matt said. So, all right. Until next time, bye-bye.